military disaster was only narrowly avoided thanks to the incredible efforts of the British in the Dunkirk evacuation, though Hitler's own incompetence played a large role in that too. With the Allied forces pinned against the sea, Hitler inexplicably ordered his panzers to stand down, relying on the Air Force to mop up the survivors and thus allowing their escape. But the Allies had lost their foothold in Europe, and Britain was increasingly looking like the next target for Nazi invasion. Surviving World War I, German veterans beamed with pride at their conquest of Europe, even as Hitler turned his hungry eyes east toward the Soviet Union. In Asia, Japan had launched a brutal war against China. The small island nation desperately needed the manpower and raw natural resources of China to fuel its dreams of empire, and with complete military superiority, had led a devastating attack against the nationalist Kuomintang and the communists. They used chemical weapons with impunity, knowing the unsophisticated Chinese couldn't hope to respond with their own, while they slaughtered civilians and POWs by the thousands. Despite a world in the grip of the most violent conflict in human history, the United States teetered on the brink of neutrality. Its citizens remembered all too well the brutality of World War I and the hundreds of thousands who had returned home with horrible wounds or not at all. The conflicts over there were a European and an Asian affair. It had no... Nothing to do with the United States. The hope to ensure peace between all mankind through the League of Nations had failed, and now Americans were more disillusioned than ever with the world. Why should they have to go fight other countries' wars when they could simply remain home, safe and secure, thanks to two big oceans and one of the best navies in the world? For Americans suffering through the Great Depression, there were simply bigger problems at home. Everyone else would have to solve their own this time. Isolationists in the U.S. believed that the ongoing conflicts in Europe and Asia were the concerns of the nations involved. It had nothing to do with the United States. Europe loved starting wars with itself, hosting a new major war every 20 years or so. Why would this be any different? The conquest of East Asia by the Japanese was unfortunate for those involved, but America and the rest of the Western powers had themselves long exploited the Chinese. In the minds of isolationists, the U.S. could simply build up its military and remain neutral, working to ensure that no navy could challenge America in the Pacific or the Atlantic. The America First Committee and similar organizations all preached the message of isolationism and political neutrality, influencing the public through radio, print advertisement, and big rallies in large cities. Celebrities of the day, such as Charles Lindbergh and popular radio priest Father Charles Coughlin, spread the message of isolationism. Lindbergh even lashed out at President Roosevelt, who publicly claimed that the Nazis were a threat to democracy everywhere. Lindbergh would go on to say, "These wars in Europe are not wars in which our civilization is defending itself against some Asiatic intruder. This is not a question of banding together to defend the white race against foreign invasion." Turns out Lindbergh was a white supremacist who also claimed that racial strength is vital. He even wrote a Reader's Digest article stating that our civilization depends on a Western wall of race and arms which can hold back the infiltration of inferior blood. The America First Committee liked what it heard from Lindbergh, and soon its leader, Robert E. Wood, head of Sears Roebuck, invited Lindbergh to join the group and preach the good news about white supremacy and isolationism across the country. However, isolationist movements began to stumble thanks to Lindbergh himself. His previous glory and fame for feats in aviation had already tarnished significantly due to his blatant racism. But in a speech in Des Moines, Lindbergh announced it was time to name names. According to Lindbergh, the three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. Pressed on the matter, Lindbergh claimed that the Jews, of all people, should be fighting the hardest against the war, as in his eyes, they would suffer the most. He then denounced the infiltration of the press, film industry, radio, and government by Jews. Lindbergh was immediately denounced as an anti-Semite. Interventionists, meanwhile, preached their own gospel. The U.S. didn't just have a moral obligation to stand against Hitler, but a national defense obligation. If the democracies of Western Europe fell to Hitler, then this critical line of defense against a powerful Germany would also fall and leave the U.S. alone to face it in some future conflict. If France and Britain fell, Hitler would be in control of much of the world's oceans and the vast resources of the rest of the planet, as none would be able to oppose him. President Roosevelt described the situation as living at the point of a gun. Most interventionists believed that direct U.S. involvement was inevitable, but others called for a relaxation of the Neutrality Acts, so the U.S. could instead equip Western powers with weapons and not have to do the fighting itself. William Allen White, chairman of the interventionist organization Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies, claimed that the best way to keep the U.S. out of war was to arm Britain. American opinion, however, was swiftly changing. In January of 1940, a public opinion poll showed that 88% of Americans opposed declaring war against the Axis powers. In June, only 35% of Americans believed they should even risk war by providing direct assistance to the Allies. However, France fell quickly after that, and Britain came under all-out assault, as the Royal Air Force heroically fought the superior German Luftwaffe off. As the battle for Britain began, 52% of Americans now believe that the U.S. should risk war by aiding England. But as it became clear Britain was holding off the Germans from invading, public opinion swung even more in favor of joining the war. By April 1941, 68% of Americans favored going to war against the Axis. On December 7, 1941, the debate over America's entry into World War II ended. Congress declared war on Imperial Japan with a nearly unanimous vote. Only Montana's Jeannette Rankin, a pacifist and the first woman ever elected to Congress, voted against the war. Germany and Italy soon declared war against America, and history as we know it fell into place. But what if America had stayed out? The best way to tackle this question is to pose two different scenarios at the same time. In one scenario, the isolationists win the battle of public opinion